Luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Good afternoon. I'm Lloyd Anderson, President of City Club. Today we focus on a means of creating compatible relationship between growth and the environment. Our speaker, Bob Doppelt, is Director of the Center for Watershed and Community Health at the Hatfield School of Government at Portland State. New members today are David Swanson, Director of Development, Warner Pacific College; Todd Cotton, Geotech Engineer, CH2M Hill; Timothy Hemstreet, Environmental Engineer, CH2M Hill; Darren Nakata, Environmental Consultant, CH2M Hill; Tom Arnold, Project Manager, CH2M Hill; and Liz Field, Management Consultant. Guess where? Would you please stand? On Friday, March the 31st, join us as we focus on the important role of arts education in building a 21st century workforce. Delane Easton, California Superintendent of Public Schools; Stan Bunn, Oregon Superintendent of Public Instruction; and Ben Canada, Superintendent of the Portland Public Schools, will form our panel of experts on the subject. The program will be moderated by Mike Pepe, Executive Director of the Regional Arts and Culture Council, which is co-sponsoring the program. On Friday, April the 7th, our program will feature Washington Post political columnist David Broder. He will address the subject of the initiative process for the perspectives outlined in his new book, Democracy Derailed: Initiative Campaigns and the Power of Money. Mr. Broder spent time in Oregon doing research and used the City Club's 1996 report on the initiative process in writing the book. There will be a pre-registration coupon for City Club members in this week's bulletin. The meeting will be at the Mountain Athletic Club. Our membership 2000 campaign continues. Please join us. The applications are on the information table at the back of the room. If you wish to visit one of our public schools during the week of April the 24th to 28th as part of Back to School Week, you can sign up on the green sheet on your tables. You will be contacted about a visit to a school near you. Before we begin today's program, Kurt Krause, co-chair of the Business and Technology Committee, would like to tell you about his committee's project related to today's topic. Kurt?
Thank you. Your Technology and Business Committee is developing an informational study, and the topic is sustainability. Our first challenge is the very definition of the term itself. We have heard from 20 witnesses who have varying understandings of sustainability, including today's speaker, Bob Doppelt. We have surveyed 40 organizations, public, private, and political, to better understand their practices, policies, and resources directed at sustainability. We have followed with interest the governor's commitment to developing a sustainability legacy. And now we're in that challenging period of actually writing the report. It is scheduled to be completed in the next 2 months. My request to you is that if you, we would like you to contact us if your organization has a stand on sustainability and wishes to be included. And finally, please look for our final report that will be directed at that equally elusive term, livability. Thanks.
Thanks, Kurt. Our member host today is Bruce Pearson, who's co-chair of the Growth and Management and Environmental Committee. He will ask the first question of our speaker. Bruce works in software and development at Metagraphics. Following Bruce's question, we'll open up questions from the floor with a microphone over here to my right. If you have a question and are too shy to ask it, feel free to write a question and the staff member will bring it up to the head table. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part by corporate contributions from Barney and Worth, Kaiser Permanente Health Systems, Wells Fargo Bank. We're very grateful for their support. The negative environmental footprint that each of us leaves in our state is growing, but very gradually. In countries where economic growth at any cost is the public policy, the results are more obvious. Here, the incremental increase in our pollution combined with increase in our population may be unnoticed for several years. In a state which prides itself for its environmental quality, the long-term changes are of major concern. What, if anything, can we do about it? Here to offer some suggestions is Bob Doppelt, Director of the Center for Watershed and Community Health, a nonprofit research institute affiliated with the Hatfield School of Government at Portland State. The center is focused on new approaches to environmental governance. Bob is also a senior fellow with the Columbia Pacific Institute and adjunct professor at Portland State. He's currently directing a project to establish a sustainability plan for Oregon, is managing an environmental report for Oregon Progress Board, and managing a study to analyze the economic benefits of activities to restore salmon and create a more environmentally efficient economy. Sounds busy. In his over 20 years of experience in sustainable development and environmental policy, he founded and directed the Pacific Rivers Council, was involved in strategy in the passage of Oregon's omnibus National Wild and Scenic River Act, and a range of both national and state issues associated with rivers and their watersheds. Bob, what can we do to save ourselves?
Well, with that big question, I don't know what I'm going to say, but thank you very much for having me here today. I want to thank the board of the City Club and the staff for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure and my honor to be here. I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of bad news, but it's just going to be a little bit because I really want to focus on a lot of good news, and I think there's good news out there for us. But the bad news, I think, really has to set the plate for us, has to set the stimulus for what we really want to try and achieve here. And the bad news is, as Lloyd just alluded to, that despite our best attempts, the data shows that environmental impacts in Oregon, as measured by waste emissions and hazardous waste emissions, air and water emissions, CO2 and energy emissions, et cetera, are growing at or above the rate of population and economic growth in this state. This comes at a time when many of our environmental resources, such as water quality, forests, riparian areas, and native fish and wildlife species, are below levels that we would consider to be healthy. So we're continuing to add insults to the environment in a time in which the environment, in many cases, is not all that healthy yet. Let me give you just a little bit of an example. In 1992, when our population was about 2,900,000 people, Oregonians created about 4,900,000 tons of pollution and waste. That equated to about 1.67 tons of pollution and waste per person. By 1996, when our population had grown to over 1 million, about 3,100,000 people, we had generated 9 million tons of pollution which equated to 2.85 tons of pollution and waste per person. So it's growing. I think the good news there, if there is good news, is that you shouldn't feel alone. These are global trends. We see this occurring all over the globe and certainly all over the United States. For example, did you know that Americans waste or cause to be wasted nearly 3.5 billion tons of materials into landfills a year, 3.3 trillion tons of carbon and CO2 gases, 28 billion pounds of organic foods that we throw away from our restaurants and our homes, 710 billion pounds of hazardous waste that's produced from the chemical production process, and 3.7 trillion tons of construction debris. And that's just part of our waste and pollution. That's the only bad news I'm going to give you. I'm going to start talking about good news from this point forward. The point of this is to make it clear that we have not addressed our environmental issues in Oregon. And despite all of our best attempts and all of our exemplary environmental laws and environmental programs that the state of Oregon has, that local communities have, we still don't have a system in place that can prevent the continued increase in environmental impacts as our state grows. And that's really the challenge before Oregonians in this next century. It's also why this century will be the century of the environment. The spotted owl, this endangered salmon, and others have just been a warm-up. And I'm sorry to tell you that, but because of these trends, and it's not just in Oregon, again, it's happening globally, this is going to be the century of the environment. So what do? How do we deal with the fact that environmental impacts are growing at or above the rate of population and economic growth? Do we somehow try to prevent growth? I think it is really important to stop subsidizing environmentally harmful growth, which we often do today. But I think we need to make a clear choice that we're not going to choose between growing the economy to grow our way out of these problems or contracting the economy to shrink our economy and solve these problems. Because a shrinking economy holds very little hope for the poor or for business or consumers, and it's simply impractical today in our global world. Yet growing the economy in the traditional way, the way we've done it so far, will only lead to more pollution and waste and more environmental impacts. So we've got to find a different approach. And the only viable choice is to develop a system and an approach that decouples or severs the link between environmental growth and economic impacts. This means fostering increased competitiveness and job creation for rural and urban Oregonians while we simultaneously reduce our environmental impacts in the products and services we produce and the way we build infrastructure and construct buildings. Severing the links between economic growth and population growth and environmental impacts requires that we create a more environmentally sustainable economy. And that's the real focus of the rest of my discussion today. Well, what does it mean to create a more environmentally and economically sustainable economy? In broad terms, what it means is developing a system which allows us to pass along to future generations ample and healthy stocks of key environmental capital, productive and uncontaminated soils, clean water, clean air, a predictable climate, an intact ozone layer, fertile forest and estuaries and oceans, and abundant and genetically diverse populations of fish, plants, and native species. To achieve this, in practical terms, developing an environmentally and sustainable economy requires that we apply cost-effective, practical, common-sense techniques to first dramatically increase the efficiency by which energy and materials and natural resources are extracted from the earth, while extracting those in a way that protects key natural resources and processes, Creating a more environmentally and economically sustainable economy requires that we dramatically reduce the amount of toxic materials, energy, and raw materials we use in the production and use of goods and services. And creating a more environmentally and economically sustainable economy requires that we significantly increase the use and development of renewable energy and dramatically increase the reuse and recycling of materials that we currently think of as waste, both within our own organizations and businesses and between organizations and businesses and communities. We need to begin to turn our waste into food for someone else's product or service. These steps can help us sever the link between growth and impacts while also providing the same or better quality of goods and services. And I'm going to talk about how we can actually achieve that in a second. But in short, what we must do is strategically phase in over a long time frame, but with some things happening right away and other things being phased in over time, the use of non-polluting materials, production processes, goods and services, and environmentally sound land use and development practices that prevent problems in the first place. The result will be better goods and services, higher quality goods and services, not less quality goods and services. Well, said differently, sustainability to me is about controlling losses and reducing our waste. Just as salmon should be considered a keystone species for endangered fish and problems in our streams, pollution and waste and habitat impacts must be seen as indicators of inefficiency in our economy. They're an economic indicator that something's wrong. Peter Coors, the CEO of Coors Brewing, I think said it very well. He said, "All waste is lost profit. Pollution and waste are things we have paid for but cannot sell." And therein lies the opportunity for Oregon. If Oregon makes a concerted effort to become a national, indeed even a global leader in environmentally and economically sustainable development, we can sever the connection between growth and impacts and set Oregon on a much, much different path. As the connection between growth and environmental impacts suggests, the data suggests, we can't decouple growth and impacts by trying to treat environmental impacts after they have been created. That's what we've been trying to do for the last 30 years. That hasn't worked. It would be worse had we not done that, but that doesn't work. We need a state-level sustainable development initiative and a community-level sustainable development initiative which helps everyone phase in strategies to prevent problems before they arise. Well, is it really possible to decouple growth from impacts? Is this just pie in the sky? The good news is that it is possible to do this. In fact, it's already been done. We're not alone, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel. The Netherlands is the first country on earth to have successfully decoupled economic growth from environmental impacts. They did this by adopting a national sustainable development program that involved the national government, local provinces, communities, and the private sector all working together. And I think that's critical. No one element alone is going to be able to solve these problems. They've actually been able to measure the reduction in emissions and discharges and other sorts of environmental insults and simultaneously measure the economic well-being of the economic sectors that were affected by those changes and as the growth of the economy in general. And their growth is going up and those impacts are going down to specific target levels that they've set. Sweden and Denmark and Austria and New Zealand and a number of other countries in the European Union have now adopted similar goals and similar strategies. And if these countries can do it, so can the citizens of Oregon. Indeed, Oregon companies, big and small, some that representatives of those firms that I see sitting here in the audience today, have already begun efforts along these lines. And let me give you just a few examples. These companies joined us yesterday for a press conference where we released a set of information about a poll we did on sustainability that I'm going to talk about in a few seconds here. But Norm Thompson Outfitters, which is a premier clothing catalog retailer, is now urging the catalog industry to embrace sustainability. while they themselves are beginning to phase in new materials in their production line, such as organic cottons. They've also adopted a salmon purchasing policy that supports restoration of salmon runs, equity for fishers, and consumer education. Neil Kelly Company, and Julia Spence is here from Neil Kelly, and who hosted us yesterday, is a 54-year-old Oregon-based residential remodeler, contractor, and cabinet maker, which has instituted a program to recycle its construction materials. They've launched a cabinet line made of certified sustainable materials with low and non-toxic finishes and adhesives, and they have begun using wheat board as a cabinet case material across all their lines. They also recently adopted Renewal by Anderson, a window that is made from recycled materials. In Klamath Falls, the Collins Company, which is a large timber owner and producer of plywood and other timber products, has sustainably certified all of its forest lands and developed a sustainability plan for its manufacturing plant that saved the company about $1 million a year in the first year alone, while dramatically reducing emissions and discharges. And there are a number of other examples of companies and organizations in Oregon that are already applying sustainability strategies. So there's a growing stable of evidence that suggests that if we develop a statewide sustainable development initiative involving an interlinked state government, private sector, local community program, we can sever the links between economic development and environmental impacts. And this will be a win-win for everyone. It's one of those few opportunities where we really may have a win-win. It will be good for the bottom line of government. It will be good for the bottom line of business. It will help us reduce our waste, help protect our drinking water, help protect our food supplies, and almost as a side benefit, help us protect the environment. So how do we do this? How do we develop this comprehensive state-level sustainability initiative? I've had the opportunity the last number of years to go all over the globe looking at these programs unfolding in various countries and in communities. It's been a rough job. Somebody has to do it, though. So, it's been really fascinating to learn from folks in the trenches as to what they've been doing. But it seems to me there are three key elements of success. The first is that government must be a prime mover. Government must declare that growing in a new way, adopting a path towards sustainable development, is a top priority. And they must declare this in policies and programs. Government must then set clear goals for what we're trying to achieve in sustainability and specific targets, which are the reduction levels we want to see in the amount of toxic materials we're using and toxic emissions we have, et cetera, and clear goals or principles to guide sustainability efforts. While private firms and communities can do quite a bit on their own to work on sustainability, as many firms here in Oregon are already doing in some communities, including the Portland Sustainability Commission, I think evidence is pretty sufficient from across the globe that they won't go all that far without leadership and support from government, because they will bump into eventually numerous policy and programmatic obstacles. Only government can provide the overarching framework needed to provide a common mission for all of us to shoot for and to stimulate and support efforts to achieve that. There's an old saying that if you don't know where you're going, any path will get you there. And that's really true for this kind of sustainability effort. That's why we need some pretty clear, measurable goals as to the types of changes we're trying to achieve in our environmental programs, and we also need clear goals so we can measure our progress in trying to achieve those. And only government can establish these goals for the environment, because government is the only entity that has responsibility for the commons, that is, the environment we all share. Individual companies can adopt the goals, and communities within their own companies and communities that are critical, and that's vital. But they don't have the knowledge base, the information, nor the responsibility for managing the overall environment. That's what government has, and that's why setting those clear goals and objectives is so vital from the public sector. We at Portland State University are managing a project called the Oregon State of the Environment Report, which is for the Oregon Progress Board. It will be the first comprehensive assessment of the condition, trends, and risks to Oregon's environment. The intent is to provide a platform for setting specific sustainability targets. It will be released in about 6 weeks. Knock on wood. Is this wood? And that, I think, is something I encourage you to watch for. I think it'll be a very, very important report and piece of information for the state. It can really set the platform or set the baseline to allow us to begin to set those broader goals. Second, once the issue has been declared, that the sustainability has been declared a top priority, and measurable goals and targets and sustainability principles have been set. And let me back up and say that sustainability principles are just as important as specific targets, because in many cases we need to know what kind of reduction levels are needed to manage and protect water quality or forests or other key environmental resources. But in many other cases, we don't know how our specific action may affect the environment. There's not a direct cause and effect that we can measure. So adopting a set of sustainability principles by which we sort of implement into our companies and into our households and into our government programs, we can know what makes sense to do and what does not make sense to do, because we know that if we follow these principles, we will not be impacting the environment, and if we violate those principles, we may be impacting the environment. The natural step has a set of principles. There's a number of other sustainability principles that are very valuable, and we can talk about what those are in the question and answer period if you'd like to. But my point is that both targets and principles are needed. Either alone won't get us ultimately where we want to go. So once government has taken that step, and I encourage the city of Portland and other local governments to take the same step as the state of Oregon in terms of trying to declare that achieving sustainability is a top priority, government then needs to get its own internal act together. It has to become more sustainable internally, and it has to begin to change its policies and programs that affect external constituents, you and I, and communities, to be able to get out of the way of the private sector and communities with their efforts to achieve sustainability, if it's in the way, or to find out ways to support private sector and community efforts through new technical assistance programs, new grants, shifts in taxes, and other sorts of strategies. In terms of internal operations, government needs to look at its purchasing policies and its fleet management, its transportation systems, its maintenance practices, its construction practices, its water and waste management, et cetera, just the same as any business needs to look at those practices. And the goal, again, should be to try to develop a stepwise strategy to phase out the use of toxic materials and substances, to reduce energy, water, and material use, and promote the reuse and recycling of waste in the goods and services it produces, as well as trying to develop infrastructure and construction projects that are designed to work with nature and prevent impacts on environmental stocks. All of those kinds of steps can actually be achieved in ways that saves government money. Government also needs to look at its external policies and programs, such as the taxation system, its fees, its licensings, its subsidies especially, its information and public education systems. One of the biggest needs is for government to, at all levels, to begin to develop what I'll call outcome-based environmental regulatory programs. And that means government needs to, again, set those clear goals and targets, but it needs to free up the private sector and communities to achieve those goals in their own least cost way. And that allows the private sector and communities to really innovate and find solutions on their own. But in doing this, the existing regulatory system, environmental regulatory system, needs to remain in place because of the risk of free riders. And what I mean by that is entities that won't do anything. So we still need to have the regulatory system there working very hard. This is not a big government idea. The government needs to provide a framework to support and mobilize and guide efforts by the private sector and community and to clean up their own act, but it's not a major regulatory program. I haven't seen that be successful anywhere around the globe. The most successful programs I've seen are where government is a stimulus. The end result of these kinds of activities within government should be the development of environmental management systems for all aspects of government based on principles of sustainability. Environmental management systems are comprehensive programs that really manage from policy positions all the way down to actual implementation how government manages its environmental issues. And these kinds of steps can save government substantial money. For example, the North Carolina Department of Corrections implemented a sustainability program in 1998, due to a challenge by their governor. And the Brown Creek Correctional Institution reduced its waste by 60% by composting food and shredded paper and dryer lint and even hair from the barbershop. The paint plant at the Correctional Institute saves now $325,000 a year by reusing steel drums 60 times rather than 6. They also, the print shop began to save 200 million pieces of paper a year and $7 million in printing costs simply by beginning to send print jobs digitally to agencies within the state. They also applied a utility monitoring system and reviewed its utility contracts and saved $460,000 a year now. I don't know whether those kind of savings will be found in every agency in Oregon, but I think there will be substantial savings found at the state and local government level if we really do this right. And these are just some of the examples. So to recap, the first and second steps are that the state, the public officials must declare that achieving sustainable development is a priority, and clear, measurable goals, targets, and principles must be set. And then government must clean up its own act and provide a framework to support and encourage the private sector and communities to do the same. In short, government must steer the process. That's what this is about. Because the third and perhaps even the most critical element of the strategy is that the private sector and communities must do most of the rowing. They've got to do the hard work, and this is critical. The private sector and communities must step to the plate and develop multiple self-generated, customized strategies to achieve the sustainability goals and targets that have been set. We shouldn't wait for the next crisis, the next endangered salmon or the next spotted owl. Let's start now on your own and start working on these efforts. And sustainability within the private sector and communities involves efforts within all aspects of what I'll call the economic value chain. Within the extraction side, where we take wood and water and minerals from the earth. In the midstream side, where we turn those materials into goods and services through our production system. And then on the downstream side, where we emit those materials back as waste. Collins Pine is a classic example, a perfect example of the types of steps that can be taken in the upstream resource extraction side, if you will, by adopting sustainable forestry practices on all of their forest lands in southern Oregon. They became certified as early as 1993. This is not something that's new to them. This is something that's always been a commitment. But there's all sorts of examples of sustainable forestry and farming and fishing and energy that can be applied across Oregon within the private sector. We just need to really ratchet those efforts up. The Fred Meyer baking plant here in Clackamas is a good example of what can be done in the midstream manufacturing side. They identified and corrected water leaks and drips, saving about 700,000 gallons of water a year, which equated to about $3,200 a year and 1,700 therms of natural gas. Boeing here in Portland is now saving $92,000 a year in energy costs, and they did this by connecting independent compressor air systems in their 3 main production buildings, which allowed them to shut down 2 of their compressors during off-peak hours. The retrofit was done a couple years ago. It cost about $180,000, and they paid it off in almost just about 2 years, while also extending the life of the compressors. Even grocery stores can engage in these kind of activities. Lamb's Thriftway in West Slope now is saving 1.3 kilowatts of energy a year, worth about $65,000 through a comprehensive retrofit program they did a number of years back, where they upgraded their refrigeration system, their store lighting, their heating and air conditioning control systems. We actually were out there about a month ago, and it's really a great example of what can be done. A good example of what can be done in this downstream waste recycling and reuse side is the graphic sciences here in Portland. They are a printer, and as part of their ink manufacturing process, they added a cooling tower to their pigment grinding process. This allowed most of the cooling water to be reused, cutting water use by 80%. The installation paid for itself in a matter of months, helping to make lower cost ink of the same quality using about 2,500,000 gallons less of water a year. So it's clear that there are numerous companies that have already done these kinds of activities. Our goal is to ratchet this up and develop broader awareness among the private sector and communities to do this. And there are numerous tools to help the private sector and communities and numerous programs. ISO 14000, which is an environmental management system that I'm sure the CH2M Hill folks know about. The Natural Step is a great program that is helping businesses learn how to apply sustainability programs. Sustainable forestry programs are out there, sustainable agriculture, et cetera. Many experts believe that we can reduce our energy and material inputs by 90 to 95% in developed nations over the next 10 years without diminishing our quality of life or the quality of goods and services at all. And I think that is doable here in Oregon also, and I think we're already seeing it. So sustainability is really an opportunity. It's not a threat. Winston Churchill once said that we are confronted by insurmountable opportunities. And I think that's true here in Oregon. I think Oregon companies and communities and governments can realize or need to take a look at and realize that any time there is pollution and waste and habitat impacts, there are opportunities to exploit niches and find ways to make money. And that's what I think we should be doing. We should turn this into a major focus. Oregon should capitalize on the opportunities that have already been shown by companies within the private sector and public sector here and elsewhere. And in doing so, we as a state can gain considerable competitive advantage, both nationally and globally. I'm a member of an organization called the International Green Planners Association. That's the term used for these sustainability programs that are playing out across the world. There's 34 different countries involved with this organization. It's based out of the Netherlands. And I can tell you that large-scale, comprehensive sustainability programs are beginning to roll out all over the world. 34 countries are working on these, and that doesn't even count the local communities and individual companies. So if we act now, if Oregon acts now to become a leader in this field, we can capture the competitive advantage. We can be developing the technologies that we sell to countries and companies looking for these things. We can really have an advantage. But if we wait, if we argue about whether the science is really true or whether we know enough, we will lose out and others will gain. Now, as you may know, Governor Kitzhaber has announced that he will sign an executive order on sustainability for state government. I think this is a really marvelous step forward that he and his staff should be congratulated for. It's still in process of being developed, but it's something that I think, if done correctly, can really change the direction of Oregon now and in the future. And with all the activity underway in the private sector and in communities, and now with the governor's announcement, we decided to see what the public thought about sustainability in general and about the governor's proposal. So we contracted with LGD Insight, which is a respected Portland public opinion survey firm. We surveyed 500 registered voters. We released the results of that poll yesterday. And there are copies of the poll on the back of the table, along with other materials that I brought. And the results were extremely surprising and very encouraging. Voters overwhelmingly believe now is the time to act to achieve sustainability. They want to see every sustainability measure we tested put in place within the next decade, and they support an executive order to make this happen. There was a 41 percentage point margin of favor, margin of support for the executive order, and strong support outpaced strong opposition by a margin of 5-1. And what was just as encouraging is, while Democrats and independents were more likely to support the sustainability initiative, their GOP counterparts endorsed the concept by a margin of 14 points also. We also found support, although it was less, but it's still a margin of support that were pretty strong in rural Oregon compared to the Portland metropolitan area. In other words, we found no base opposition to sustainability in the governor's proposal. And I think that's very encouraging. This did not break out as a partisan issue as I thought it could. Voters were most vocal in support of the government setting clear goals and indicators, cleaning up its own act, providing technical assistance in loan and research and development, as well as new regulations, et cetera, new regulatory strategies to help business and communities achieve the sustainability goals. So in closing, it seems to me the time is ripe for achieving sustainability here in Oregon. It's clear that a majority of voters, as well as many, many leading companies, are already getting interested or are already engaged in these activities and support it. Voters endorse the basic concepts, the need for government action, and the specific steps to achieve those goals. They think it's just the right thing to do, basically, based on the polling. They think it's a common sense approach and a practical approach. I think we have an opportunity before us where Oregon can once again do what it does best, and that is to innovate and create and solve the problems of the future. We in Oregon and in the U.S. have created an economic miracle that we should all be very, very proud of. I can tell you, based on my work with this international organization, countries all over the world are trying to emulate what we've done here. And now we need to use our energy and our optimism and our expertise to take the next major step, and that is to create a more environmentally and economically sustainable economy. And in doing that, we can sever the links between growth and environmental impacts. Each one of you can play a major role in that effort. This is not just government. It's not just some company out there. This is about all of us in this room, and I encourage us to start as quick as we can. Thank you very much. I'm going to sit down. Can I sit down? Okay.
Thanks a lot for your presentation. Some of the examples that you gave with Neil Kelly and Collins Pine and some of these other companies are really pretty impressive with what they're doing with this. I guess what I'm wondering about myself, and I think probably a lot of other people in this room work for companies where you can't identify areas very easily where a lot of these kinds of savings can be done, and you can't point to a lot of programs easily about ways to do things. And I think that comes down to each of us as an individual too. And I guess what I'm wondering about is what can you do, or what would you really recommend to help all of us in those kinds of businesses where we work in an office building or something like this, where there potentially could be a lot of room to do things, how can you really raise public awareness for each of us as individuals, and then also in other things where it isn't obvious that things need to be done?
Well, that's a really good question, and certainly one we're all confronted by. I think one of the key issues is to sort of think about why aren't we doing this already? What would be the obstacles? I mean, many economists will say, well, there's not just free money laying on the floor. If it was there, we'd have done it already. And why haven't we? Well, the reason is, I think there's two reasons. One is what I call path dependency. We often, society often comes up with certain views of the nature of a problem and certain views of the solution to that problem, and then we begin to make investments and build programs and management systems around those views, and we get dependent on that path. Oftentimes, it turns out that those views were wrong, or they were right for the time, but have now become outdated. Things change. And so when I work with a number of entities trying to help them develop sustainability plans, and almost invariably what I hear is, we don't have an opportunity here, there's not really much we can do. And we find there's always an opportunity. And it requires that we look with a different lens on. We have to look at opportunities and think about where are we creating waste, possibly? Where are we using too much energy, et cetera? So I would suggest that one of the first things to do is just to sit down and sort of take a pencil, piece of paper, and map out the inputs that may be coming into your firm or your household. What are you buying? What are you taking in through the wires or through the pipes? Energy, water, et cetera. What are you purchasing at a store? How are you using it in your company or in your household? And how much are you throwing out? And that will help you really begin to get a look at what you may be able to do. One of the most fun things that I do, I work quite a bit on creating waste-based businesses for nonprofits, meaning recycling and reuse businesses. And we become garbologists, as I call it. We go and the first thing we do in a community is we go to the dump. And we try to find out what's ending up in the landfill. And then we go to the transfer sites and we find out what's there. And just by following the waste, if you will, we follow the money. We find business opportunities and job opportunities using the waste in a different way. And I think the same kind of strategies can be used within your firms and businesses. Just start to think about what you take in, what you use, and what goes out the other end. And/or you can look at applying principles of sustainability like the natural step principles and say, well, are we using toxic materials consistently, which is one of the principles of the natural step, and just start to look for ways to, first of all, find out what is toxic. Is the paper we're using made of toxic material, et cetera, and look for ways to phase those kinds of impacts out.
I want to get back. My name is Tom Dunn. I'm a City Club member. I want to get back to your bad news. In the 90s, according to your figures, the waste, per capita waste production has increased something like 30%. And I think it would be very useful for somebody to break that out for us. I mean, some things must have gone, I presume some things have gone down a bit, but some components of that have gone up a lot. And for every individual to have that broken down a bit, you could do it now if you wanted to, might be helpful.
Actually, I don't have that. Why don't you hand me that sheet? See, I don't have all the information here, but it will be in the State of the Environment report in 6 weeks that will be released. No, I don't have the breakdown here. But it's true, some have gone up, some have gone down, but all in all, almost all of them continue to grow, even if energy use, for example, I think is growing below the rate of population growth. So we've done a better job per capita with energy use, but there's more of us. So aggregate-wise, it's still growing. So we've got, it's sort of a mix and match, but all in all, when you aggregate them together. But I think it's absolutely correct that we want to target the biggest problems and really know where those are. We are producing that information.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. Mr. Doppelt, you mentioned that we've been growing impacts faster than population. For the past 10 years, we've been growing automobiles faster than people in the state. And yet, what government is ready to do is make us vote for additional dedicated gas taxes for more automobiles, for more roads, and not available to alternatives. And I think that when you mention government means the legislature in Salem, it's high time they should let the people vote on increasing the taxes, yes, for general transportation, so that they can be spent on what is more productive, what can be impacted more for less money. And obviously, we need more bus service tying the cities of Oregon together, and we need more service in Portland. How can we get that done?
I don't know. Right. I think more public discussion, more pressure, basically. There's an old friend of mine from Washington, D.C. used to use a term that I thought was very apropos. Political change comes about from endless pressure applied endlessly. And I think that's what that really requires.
I'm trying.
But I think you raised an excellent point, if I may, just, and that is that that's the kind of example of how important public policy and government is. We think that public policy and government won't make a difference. We, as individual companies or communities, can go and do this on our own. But the subsidies that government provides, the payments, the tax system, et cetera, influences the flow of capital and money in our society tremendously, and will really determine whether or not we can sever those links between growth and impacts. It's vital. We can't just do this at the private sector level alone, although every company and every community ought to get going and go as far as they can, but we've got to really have that overall framework.
Here's a written question. Oregon has set a national standard for the construction operation of natural gas power plants. Example, the Klamath Falls plant, which emphasizes reduction and offset of toxic waste. Would you care to comment?
I think it's great. We need more. You know, if we're going to address ozone problems, I think that's one of the critical elements is moving to non-toxic energy sources, and natural gas is one of those best ones. So I think that's a real important step.
I'm Joe Nadal, a member. I'm wondering about the importance of increasing population. That hasn't been mentioned. Do we assume that the increase in population, say in Oregon, is absolutely uncontrollable? I rather assume it may be for various reasons. Or is that just putting off the day when we'll have to have even another program? Maybe that's for another century. Or do you feel that if the measures you suggest could be put into effect, that increases in population by immigration, and then those that are here adding to the population by having large families? I should speak. I used to be very, very much pleased to tell about my family and my grandchildren and so on. Maybe we should all be a little embarrassed about that, unless you feel, from your studies that it's absolutely irrelevant or simply impractical to do anything about it. Thank you.
That's a good question. Let me respond to that in 2 or 3 different ways. First of all, I personally, how many of you are actually native Oregonians? Maybe half the group. So how do we feel about having others come in from out of state, given that half of us are them, right? And if the Native Americans are correct, we're all them, right? So I, for one, have a very hard time. I hope we never adopt a policy that's anti-immigrant. I just think that's not a good policy. And as you look around the world, can you find any country where that's actually succeeded in a very effective way? Usually it ends up in some form of bloodshed. So I think that's a pretty dangerous strategy. The other answer to that, though, is I have seen studies that have been done in Europe, one done by a research institute called the Wuppertal Institute in Wuppertal, Germany, where they've actually looked at if we reduced our energy and material use and intensity, the amount of materials that goes into products and services, et cetera, by this 90%, which we now think is possible. It's called factor 10, if you will, a factor 10 increase. How much goods and services can we provide? And that also means protecting and using land much more efficiently, and I think the Oregon land use system is one of the leaders in that effort. If we increase our efficient use of land and the efficient use of materials and energy, they found that, in fact, especially in Europe, but mostly globally, they thought, in fact, we could maintain the existing standard of living even with the population growth that's predicted in the future. In fact, that's where they ended up with a prediction that we needed a factor 10 increase of efficiency in energy use and material intensity, because that's where we got to an equilibrium on maintaining the existing standard of living and improving the standard of living in the developing countries. So it may be possible. Now, whether socially we're into that with a whole lot more people, that's a different question, and I think that's a question that's we all have to answer yet.
Laura Nigro, City Club member. Joe's entire question actually encapsulated mine, but I will ask it again because I want to probe you a little bit further. So regarding the whole world's ever-increasing human population, are you saying then that you personally are resigned to that as an inexorable reality rather than viewing it as yet another element integral to the system you've described, which also warrants at least some attention, if not directed adjustment?
Well, if you're asking my own personal view, absolutely population growth is an issue we need to focus on. There's no question about that. Asking it from a technical perspective, can we provide goods and services for enough if we take these steps? I think the answer may be yes, although there's a lot of unknowns in that. But I think we ought to protect our options and look at how we address population growth. Even if we can address environmental issues, we still may not be able to basically put up with that many of us. I think that's a very significant issue.
Thank you.
I'm Don Wagoner, member. And there was a book came out 3 or 4 years ago. I imagine you're very well aware of it, Our Stolen Future, and documented the way various hormones and estrogens and such stop effective reproduction in the wild and probably within the human population as well. And the question I have is, do you know of any research? We've been really concentrating, for example, on breaching dams, not breaching dams, putting in pesticides or things or not, and protecting stream beds. But is there research that might bear on this, that might say that such things as PCBs and DTTs and the thousands of other things that we don't know what they really do, but we know they're doing something bad, that might bear on this issue? Can you speak to that?
Well, I think you've just said it very well. I mean, clearly, adding more toxic materials to the environment is not a good thing. We don't know the limit at which nature can naturally absorb and reassimilate and break down those materials. We certainly don't know what the potential impacts are when those materials and substances mix together because they form new molecules often. And we don't know the cumulative effect of having all these. We do know that they hang around in nature for a long, long, long time. We may believe that we are in compliance here in Oregon by meeting minimum compliance standards with these emissions, but even the emissions we are releasing, and we're actually releasing much more than the minimum compliance, they're going somewhere in nature. They're not disappearing. Those toxic molecules are hanging around, and they are affecting something over time. A good way to think about pollution is to think about your bathtub. If you open the drain of your bathtub at the same rate that the water can get out the bottom, everything's fine, right? If you open it just a little faster than the water can drain, it will eventually overflow and run on the floor. And so nature does have the ability to break down most toxic, not all, but some toxic materials and other sort of pollutants, but only at a natural rate where it can break it down and reassimilate them back, those materials back into nature. But if we release them faster than that, which we are clearly doing today, nature can't break it down, and the tub will overflow. The other part of that is to think about when your tub overflows, do you normally run around the room with towels and try to throw your towels on the floor to keep it from running into the closet and into the cabinets, et cetera, or do you rush to simply turn off the spigot first? Well, the way we address environmental problems today is we don't turn off the spigot. We run around trying to figure out how much damage may this really cause, and we try to prevent or mitigate problems on one thing or another, rather than going back and saying, wait a second, let's figure out how to turn the spigot off. And that's really what sustainability is about, as opposed to other environmental management strategies.
2 more questions. One I'll read and the other one here. In Germany, auto manufacturers are now required to take back and dispose of cars that have reached the end of their useful functions. Is there anything like this planned in the U.S.?
That's a great question. Those are what we call product take-back policies, and they are very important. They are being discussed here in the U.S. We have some product take-back policies. The bottle bill is a product take-backs policy, if you will. There's a conference in about 2 weeks in Seattle, a major conference on this very issue. I've not seen it hit any legislature yet, but I would think it's coming. Again, this will be the century of the environment, and these issues will eventually push their way onto those policy agendas on their own. I'll say something interesting about the product take-back policies. Though the implications of those policies are already pushing their way through the supply chain back into this country. In Germany and in other parts of Europe,